I'm standing in front of the Mahanirvana room in Ramana ashram. This is the place where Bhagavan lived for the last 6 months of his life, and from here he would travel about 15 yards over there to give darshan in the new hall, which was opened in 1949. So while he was in there, he was giving darshan on the stone sofa, which is now behind the stone statue. He would go from there over the step in here and live here for most of the time during the day. He was very sick at this time. He'd already had several operations, and this was the nearest, the most convenient point for him to live during the last few months. This building has an interesting history in that in the mid-1940s, a very energetic Tamil lady called Janaki Mata came to the ashram and asked where the women's bathroom was. And when she was told there wasn't one, she got very upset and organized Swami to build one especially for her and the women devotees. And this was the building they erected. So originally this was the first women's bathroom. When Bhagavan started to live in the new hall over there in 1949, he found it increasingly hard to go to and from his bathroom, and because this was slightly nearer than his usual one, he started to use this one. And then, when he became more feeble in the last few months of his life, he simply moved into this room. It was converted into his final quarters. He lived in this room here, and the back quarters, which is the toilet room, was his bathroom. We're now inside the Nirvana room, looking at a picture that was taken probably on the last day of Bhagavan's life on April 14th, 1950. You can see his left arm is bandaged. There was a sarcoma which eventually caused systemic poisoning to his body. He refused to have his arm amputated, which was the final recommended advice from all the doctors who saw him, and said let the body take its course. And finally on April 14th he passed away inside this room at 8:47 as all the assembled devotees outside were chanting Akshara Malai for the last time. Sadhu Om told me he was outside chanting at the time that they'd got to verse 72 when Bhagavan finally breathed his last breath. So they were probably chanting for about half an hour before he finally passed away. I'm sitting on the floor inside the Nirvana room, which was kept more or less the way it was when Bhagavan passed away. When I first came into this room more than 35 years ago, it was full of everything that was here on the night Bhagavan died. There was a revolving bookcase somewhere down here, which was Bhagavan's personal collection of books. Whenever somebody asked him a question and there was an answer from a book, he would rotate his bookcase, he would pull out the appropriate book, and he had this interesting talent that generally he would open the book and it would always open at the right page, and he would pass on the quote to the person who asked. Many other personal things were here, but they've now all been moved to an archive cum museum in a different part of the ashram. The only items which are still here from April 14th, 1950 are the bed itself, the mattress on top, and the cushions and pillows. So this is the bed that Bhagavan slept on, this is the bed that Bhagavan sat on when he gave darshan in the last few weeks of his life. There are still one or two personal items. This is called a kamandalu. This is a water pot made out of a coconut shell, and throughout his life Bhagavan would fashion these themselves. Occasionally devotees would give him their own version, and behind is a walking stick which most probably he made himself. He occasionally commented that the only personal possessions he had, apart from his kaupina, with his walking stick and his kamandalu, and there are examples of both here which are kept in his final room. The remaining items have all been moved elsewhere and put on exhibition. In Bhagavan's final months, he made a point of insisting that everybody who wanted to see him could at least have a walking darshan past his door. When he had his operations in the ashram clinic, he overruled his doctors who wanted him to have rest and made sure that everyone who wanted to see him, to reassure themselves that he was okay, was allowed to come and see him in the hospital. When he lived in this room for the last few weeks of his life, there was a daily walking darshan. All the devotees were allowed to approach the open door, namaste to him and move on. And for many of the devotees, this was their last final meeting with Bhagavan. On the night itself, when Bhagavan was obviously only a few hours away from passing away. A few of his closest devotees were inside this room. Vishwanath Swami was here, his attendants were here. Vishwanath Swami has said that the peak experience of his life, the moment when he finally understood self and experienced self, was standing in this room with Bhagavan on the final evening of his life. And he said there was a quietness, a peaceful, a serenity in this room. There was no sense of panic or grieving. He said in that moment he felt and experienced self for the first and strongest time in his life. Now, about 8 p.m. on the night that Bhagavan passed away, all the devotees were sitting outside, hoping and praying, and one of them spontaneously started singing Aksharamanamala, Bhagavan's 108 verse composition in praise of the mountain. Bhagavan heard the chanting begin, and apparently a tear started to roll down one of his cheeks. The one surefire, guaranteed way to get Bhagavan emotionally activated was to start chanting anything about Arunachala. The chanting continued for about 30 minutes, and when verse 72 was reached, Sadhu Om told me it was verse 72, Bhagavan breathed his final breath and passed away. That was 8:47 in the evening. Now, I was told, or I've read, that Robert Adams, one of Bhagavan's American devotees, wasn't here on the night that Bhagavan finally passed away. When he came back, out of curiosity, he said, "What was the last thing that Bhagavan said?" And apparently, at some point during the evening, when everybody's attention was on him, the thought occurred to Bhagavan that possibly the ashram animals were being neglected because everyone's attention was on him. So he turned to his attendant and said, "Have the peacocks been fed?" So his final sentence before he lapsed into semi-consciousness was a concern for the animals and an instruction that they shouldn't be neglected because everyone was putting their attention on him.